This will be the second video in our Orchid Shade House series. In the first video, we showed how we constructed the shade house on our small plot of rented land in Waimanalo, Hawaii. The link for that video can be found in the description below. While our first video took place over a single weekend, this second video spans about 2 years. It shows the changes and modifications made to the shade house as we became familiar with the environment and the growing conditions where the shade house was located. The only major structural update that you will see that wasn't included in the first video is the addition of a sprinkler system. The process to construct this was very simple. Standard 2-inch PVC pipes were connected under the benches using glue and pipe mounting brackets. A single line was run down the middle of each bench with risers every 4 feet. In the pictures, you will see the sprinkler heads sticking up through the benches. We will talk a bit more about the sprinklers later. Now on to the orchids. Over the first few months, orchids and a few other plants were slowly introduced to the shade house. The process was deliberate and carefully thought out. Even within such a small space, in such a mild climate as Hawaii, there was variation in light and water which were considered. Although we were in an area of Hawaii that gets ample rain, an automatic watering system was still set up. This was rented land about 30 minutes from our home. We were sometimes away for days or even longer. The system was hooked up to a battery-powered automatic timer and attached to a garden hose. The system worked well and risers could be added where plants needed more water. Or as this picture shows, the sprinklers could be capped off where there were no plants at all or where the plants required less water. One of the main design elements of the shade house was the use of galvanized fencing around the perimeter of the structure. This served a few purposes. Among them was security against animals, detraction against people, some structural support of the frame, and, as shown in this picture taken at sunrise, vertical hanging space for orchids. The usable space within the shade house was intended to be many times more than just the benches themselves. As far as vertical orchid growing goes, we will have many videos on this topic in the orchid playlist section of our page. There are 3 methods that we employ. The first is attaching hangers to pots, preferably clay pots as shown here. We will have a video on how to make these hangers. The next is growing in baskets with wire hangers. Mature plants grown this way can be stunning. Then there are mounted orchids, which are a major topic by themselves. At this stage, we made our first major update to the shade house. There was a large unused area in the middle of the structure. In this wasted space, we installed a 6-foot by 12-foot bench. We were able to salvage some construction material from a job in our building in Honolulu. We used this hardwood as a major component of building projects for the remainder of the life of this shade house. This is about 1 year into the life of the shade house. We have added many more orchids and have exhausted the usable bench space. We also built a potting bench out of the same repurposed hardwood lumber and built a utility shed to hold supplies and a few large spiders. One issue that persisted was the sagging of the overhead shade cloth and crossbeams. This was finally resolved by installing additional vertical posts on the inside of the benches. This added additional support allowed for the addition of many more plants because we were able to add overhead galvanized fencing. This dramatically increased the usable space. Effectively, the bench space was doubled by using baskets which hung from the overhead fencing. Additional to the overhead galvanized fencing for hanging pots, fencing was also added to additional places where possible to maximize space for mounted plants. Now the lessons learned. What worked, what didn't work, and what we would do differently on later shade house builds. This shade house was built at a time when we were living in a densely populated city and wanted to grow orchids. Here is the original site pre-built. The biggest learning lesson of all was that you should choose your site wisely. In our situation, we didn't have much choice. This was the site that was offered to us, and so we built on it, as much experimentally as anything. The major issues were, to the right we have compost piles. By nature, compost piles attract life. With orchids so close by, it was always an issue keeping that life at bay. This ultimately led to the abandonment of this shade house and a new build at a second site. The second major issue was that directly behind we have large pine trees. Although they were not directly overhead, they were close enough to drop needles on the shade house during windy conditions. This could be resolved by adding a plastic roof to the shade house to prevent them from dropping on the plants. We used this technique in later builds, but this removed the benefit of rainwater capture and required 100% irrigation. Thank you for watching the second and final part of this orchid shade house build. We will have many more videos related to orchid growing. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe.